In April 1864, General Nathan Bedford Forrest, commanding 1,500 Confederate troops, was on the move. Using the advantage of his victory at Okolona, he had decided to launch an attack from northern Mississippi. The Southern cavalrymen led 2 divisions, which were commanded by Brigadier General James Chalmers and Abraham Buford. His plan was to upset the Union forces nearby, recruit men, and gather supplies. Supplies for Forrest were indeed desperately needed. Forrest himself wrote,
"There is a Federal force of 500 or 600 at Fort Pillow, which I shall attend to in a day or 2, as they have horses and supplies which we need."
At this point in the war, the Confederate government was struggling to provide the horses and supplies needed for their men. His quest for these supplies would lead him to numerous engagements, including Paducah. His cavalry had significant shortages of equipment and ammunition. Approximately 24% of his command was combat ineffective due to a lack of bridles and saddles. No soldiers in his unit had the standard basic combat load of 100 rounds for an expedition. The 64 armed men with Sharp's carbines had 14 rounds apiece. Also, only 30% of the men had a revolver. It has been reported that before the assault on Fort Pillow, 3/4 of Forrest's men were suffering ammunition shortages. During this time as well, Forrest and his men were repeatedly insulted by Union forces and northern newspapers. His 3,000 battle-hardened troopers were not in the best of moods. A horse-gathering raid into Kentucky had netted a haul of 400 horses and mules for a new division of bluegrass cavalry, but it had also seen the death of Colonel A.P. Thompson during an unsuccessful and unordered attack on Union-held Fort Anderson on the Ohio River. Forrest had already withdrawn from the smallpox-ravaged town before the attack, but that did not prevent pro-Northern newspapers from crowing about the minor skirmish at Forrest's expense. The Louisville Journal, labelling the raid an abject failure, charged that Forrest's men had been gloriously drunk and but little better than a mob. The paper accused the raiders of commencing an indiscriminate pillage of the houses, before making several desperate charges upon the fort. The Federals met them with a withering fire, and in each onset, the rebel columns were broken and driven back in confusion. That was bad enough, but the Chicago Tribune levelled the explosive accusation that Forrest's men had skedaddled after killing as many Negroes as they could, which seems to have been their primary objective in coming to that area. Even worse in Southern eyes was the newspaper's provocative claim that Forrest and his men had been ignominiously beaten back by Negro soldiers with club muskets. Further rubbing salt into the wound were reports that Colonel Thompson, a well-liked young officer, had been killed by a musket ball to the forehead, fired by an ardent young African. Actually, Thompson was killed by a shell from a Union gunboat. To a man, Forrest soldiers seethed at this bogus reporting, which neglected to mention the surrender of a Federal detachment at Union City, a crossroads village in northwestern Tennessee, earlier in the raid. There, Colonel Duckworth, posing as Forrest, had bluffed garrison commander Colonel Isaac Hawkins into capitulating without a fight. Hawkins, despite holding a strong position, had handed over himself and 500 other Union soldiers, along with 300 horses and $60,000 that the garrison had recently received in pay. The Confederates joked afterwards that they would be happy to parole Hawkins in order to obtain more horses and equipment the next time they needed them. But however his campaigning was going, by the start of April, Forrest had set his eye on a Union fort on the banks of the Mississippi River, a certain Fort Pillow. Now, Fort Pillow was actually quite a sleepy place. It was named after Confederate General Gideon Pillow. When construction had begun, it was designed to protect Memphis, but it had fallen to Union troops in the summer of 1862. One Major Booth took command and began improving its unfinished defences. He had under his command a section from the 2nd U.S. Coloured Light Artillery, a lone battalion from the 6th U.S. Coloured Heavy Artillery, and the 13th West Tennessee Cavalry. In total, the fort housed around 600 men. Booth, it seemed, was extremely confident in his fortified position. He had read reports from northern newspapers in the previous weeks, which had convinced him that his area was safe. So safe that on the 3rd of April he wrote to his commanding officer, General Hurlbut, that everything is quiet within a radius of 30 or 40 miles around, and I do not think any apprehensions need to be felt or fears entertained in reference to this place being attacked or even threatened. I think it perfectly safe. I can hold the post against any force for 48 hours. Fort Pillow stood immediately below the intersection of the Mississippi and Coal, or Cold Creek, and featured 3 lines of earthen entrenchments, a semicircular outer line of earthworks, a shorter second line atop a prominent hill, and the fort itself with earthworks 6 to 8 feet high and 4 to 6 feet across. A 12-foot wide, 6-foot deep trench fronted the fort. The fort's earthworks extended in a 125-yard wide semicircle, behind which the land fell away rapidly to the river. Deep ravines crisscrossed the landscape in front of the fort, and 4 rows of barracks stood to an open terrace of land southwest of the bastion. The presence of the Union gunboat New Era, anchored just offshore and commanded by Captain Marshall, added to the defenders' false sense of security. Booth was extremely confident or extremely careless. Things were indeed quiet for 30 or 40 miles around Fort Pillow. Too quiet, but not for long. Ironically, Booth wrote this letter the day before Forrest wrote to his commanding officer, expressing his intent to take Fort Pillow and all of its supplies. On arrival and with his experienced eye, it did not take Forrest long to pinpoint Fort Pillow's fatal flaws. Not only did the numerous ravines provide perfect cover for his men, allowing them to approach as near as 25 yards without detection, but the Union artillery pieces could not be depressed sharply enough to fire at the enemy with any success. Anderson summed up the morning's findings. The width or thickness of the works across the top prevented the garrison from firing down on us, as it could only be done by mounting and exposing themselves to the unerring aim of our sharpshooters, posted behind stumps and logs, and all the neighbouring hills. They were also unable to depress their artillery so as to rake these slopes with grape and canister, and so far as safety was concerned, we were as well fortified as they were. The only difference was that they were on one side and we on the other of the same fortification. They had no sharpshooters with which to annoy our main force, while ours sent a score of bullets at every head that appeared above the walls. It was perfectly apparent to any man endowed with the smallest amount of common sense that to all intents and purposes the fort was ours. Forrest's battle plan was to use Booth's troops as a diversion whilst made the main assault upon the fortifications. The assault began 3 years to the day of the opening of the war and the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. Chalmers' force was soon successful in pushing back Booth's pickets, and they soon deployed for battle. A report after the battle described the first moves of the attack. All the Confederates advanced to the charge the moment the rifles were cracking at the picket line, and so sudden was the attack that the Federals abandoned the entire outer line of defences without serious resistance. Likewise, a defender, Lieutenant Mac Leeming, recalled how the northern defence began. Our garrison opened fire immediately. The firing continued without cessation, principally from behind logs, stumps, and under cover of thick underbrush and from high knolls. With Forrest riflemen keeping the defenders pinned down inside the fort, Captain Marshall brought New Era briefly into the fray, her guns sending 282 shells into the Confederate ranks before backing away from the bluff at 1 PM to avoid continuing sniper fire. Few of the shells did any real damage to the attacker. If anything, they merely angered the Southerners even more. Forrest was soon, however, almost regretting his decision to attack when he observed 2 new Union steamers, Olive Branch and Liberty, hastening upriver towards the fort. The first ship was loaded down with Union soldiers and artillery. Forrest immediately dispatched 2 squads of riflemen to the bluffs above and below the fort to prevent any enemy reinforcements from landing.
Shoot at everything blue betwixt wind and water.
Unbelievably, Captain Marshall, as overall commander of naval forces in the area, told the 2 boats to pass by without attempting to relieve Fort Pillow. and they proceeded on to Cairo, Illinois, apparently unaware of the fire and brimstone about to descend upon the fort and its beleaguered defenders. At 1 p.m, New Era also pulled away upriver to allow its guns to cool, having fired almost 300 shells with little effect. The adjutant of the 13th West Tennessee Cavalry describes the early attack and counter by the defenders. The rebels made a general assault on our works, which was successfully repulsed, with severe loss to them. But despite this initial success and the benefits of the defences put up by the Union forces, the defenders suffered an early disaster. As the Confederates pushed hard to break into the fort, Major Booth was passing among his men and cheering them the same, was then struck in the head by a bullet, which killed him. Amongst the bullets and cannonballs, the defence of Fort Pillow was given to Major William Bradford. A heavy blow for the Union forces, as the major was an inexperienced officer. Things got worse rapidly for the stretched defenders, as Southern sharpshooters took up advantageous positions, which sealed off any escape from Fort Pillow by land. These snipers would prove effective during the assault, as Lieutenant Leeming described again. We suffered pretty severely in the loss of commissioned officers by the unerring aim of the rebel sharpshooters. As losses began to mount for the Union defenders, Forrest himself arrived about 10 in the morning. His first view of the battle was to see a second attack being repulsed. Perhaps not wishing to stay long at Fort Pillow and not wanting to incur more losses, he decided to try another tactic. With a stalemate hanging over the embattled troops, he chose to send over a flag of truce to demand the honourable surrender of the garrison. Apparently, the message Forrest sent across was his normal message when demanding an enemy surrender. It went,
"Major, the conduct of the officers and men garrisoning Fort Pillow has been such as to entitle them to being treated as prisoners of war. I demand the unconditional surrender of this garrison, promising you that you shall be treated as prisoners of war. My men have received a fresh supply of ammunition and from their present position can easily assault and capture the fort. Should my demand be refused, I cannot be responsible for the fate of your command."
In other words, if the demand was refused, any reprisals carried out on the defenders after a storming, be they surrendering or not, the responsibility would fall on the defending commander and not Forrest himself. What is not perhaps clear, and is still hotly debated, is whether Forrest knew there were coloured units defending Fort Pillow, and more importantly, if the fort surrendered, would they be treated as combatants like their white comrades? According to Confederate sources, Forrest knew of the presence of coloured troops and agreed they would be treated equally if captured after surrender. Captain Goodman was present when Forrest was discussing this very issue. There was a discussion about it among the officers present, and it was asked whether it was intended to include the Negro soldiers as well as the white, to which both General Forrest and General Chalmers replied that it was so intended, and that if the fort surrendered, the whole garrison, white and black, should be treated as prisoners of war. The key phrase here is, if the fort surrendered. With this apparent decision agreed upon, Lieutenant Leeming was again in the middle of events. Under a flag of truce, he met with the Confederate party 150 yards from the fort's outworks. He did not give an immediate answer, and asked for 1 hour to consult with his commanding officer. But even before he had got back inside the fort to discuss options with Bradford, he was called out once more as a second message was waiting for him beyond the outworks. It was not just the truce party waiting for Leeming, but Forrest himself, now fuming and impatient. His generosity in giving the defenders an hour had apparently been misplaced. This was due to, during the allotted hour, Bradford had been attempting to land reinforcements via the gunboats, Olive Branch and Liberty. Forrest demanded a surrender within 20 minutes or he would attack immediately. Leeming returned, and passing this ultimatum on to his superiors, he was told to return to Forrest and reply that the defenders of Fort Pillow would not capitulate. When Leeming delivered this decision in writing to the enemy general, Forrest read the note, which read, "General, I will not surrender. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, L. E. Booth, commanding U.S. Forces, Fort Pillow." It seems even at this point, Bradford did not want the enemy to know the Confederates had killed the defenders' senior officer. But it seems the Union forces had already made a fatal mistake. By refusing the surrender terms, they were now forcing the Confederates to assault the fort and therefore take unnecessary casualties. On top of this, Forrest's men were now at fever pitch and were not in a forgiving mood. A commentator noted, "The wrathful Confederates, most of whom had marched all night to the outskirts of the fort, run and sniped under enemy fire all morning, and then waited anxiously in the hot afternoon sun for the final assault to begin, were in no mood to be forgiving. To a man, they believed that the Federals had been fools to refuse Forrest's surrender demand." With their blood up, the Confederates general gave the order for the attack. One of his second-in-command's Chalmers wrote about the moment. The bugle then sounded the charge. A general rush was made along the whole line, and in 5 minutes the ditch was crossed, the parapet scaled, and our troops were in possession of the fort. The Federals had succeeded in burning only a row of barracks nearest the fort before heavy Confederate fire drove them back, and now enemy sharpshooters kept the Federals pinned down, while McCulloch's men, obscured by smoke from the torch barracks, slipped in among the remaining three, just 60 yards from the southwest slope. Lieutenant Mac Leeming again later recalled, "From these barracks, the enemy kept up a murderous fire on our men, despite all our efforts to dislodge them." Forrest recalled,
"As our troops mounted and poured into the fortification, the enemy retreated toward the river, arms in hand and firing back."
The refusal of the garrison to surrender cost the Confederates another 100 men, dead and wounded. The Confederates easily overtook the fort, and the Union defenders fled from their posts and ran for the gunboats on the river below. As the organised Union defence finally collapsed, the dark deeds of this tale come into the light. In the ensuing chaos, it began with men who were taking men prisoner were fired upon by some Union soldiers who were still fighting. But the real horror began when the Confederate attackers discovered they were being opposed by coloured troops. Many of the Confederate troopers clubbed or gunned down the African Americans, despite their pleas of surrender. This brutality was not just confined to the artillery units. The Confederates turned on the Tennessee troops, who they considered to be turncoats. It was some time before the officers could restore some semblance of order. Among the dead was the fort's temporary commander, Major Bradford. DeWitt Clinton Fort, one of Forrest's men during the battle, wrote in his diary shortly after the battle, "The wildest confusion prevailed among those who had run down the bluff. Many of them had thrown down their arms while running and seemed desirous to surrender, while many others had carried their guns with them and were loading and firing back up the bluff at us with a desperation which seemed worse than senseless. We could only stand there and fire until the last man of them was ready to surrender." Now, in the confusion of battle, accidental deaths are to be expected, but this story cannot be viewed as a massacre. Not yet, anyway. Lieutenant Leeming, the man who was messenger during the parleys earlier in the day, was the highest ranking officer to survive. Nearly 30 years later, he wrote a brutal account of the storming of Fort Pillow and its grisly aftermath. "We had barely time to fire one volley before they swarmed over our works. Our line broke, and many of the troops threw down their muskets and rushed down the bluff towards the river. The rebels, meanwhile, keeping up a murderous fire. Many of the coloured soldiers, seeing that no quarter were to be given, madly leaped into the river, while the rebels stood on the banks or part up the bluff and shot at the heads of their victims. From where I fell wounded, I could plainly see this firing, and note the bullets striking the water around the black heads of the soldiers, until suddenly the muddy current became red, and I saw another life sacrificed in the cause of the Union. Here I noticed one soldier in the river, but in some way clinging to the bank. 2 Confederate soldiers pulled him out. He seemed to be wounded and crawling on his hands and knees. Finally, one of the Confederate soldiers placed his revolver on the head of the coloured soldier. As the Confederate forces began rounding up and shooting the last remnants of defiance, our regular narrator was in agony. A mini-ball had taken him in the side. Leeming is complimentary about the care he received from his enemy, who not only got him into the fort's hospital, but made sure he was seen by a surgeon and sent brandy by Chalmers, a token he really appreciated. The attention which I received at that critical moment doubtless contributed, in no small degree, to my ultimate recovery, he recalled. But his position was to be put in serious peril very soon. He recalls, "It was while lying in this building, and after further resistance on the Federal side had wholly ceased, that suddenly I heard several shots fired just outside the building, and at the same time someone, presumably a Confederate officer, galloped up and ordered the firing to cease and the arrest of someone engaged in it. It was understood that a number of coloured soldiers were shot in that firing. During the night, many of the wounded, myself among the number, were collected and placed in one of the rows of cabins just outside the fort. At irregular intervals throughout the night, stray firing could be heard in the vicinity, telling but too plainly that the hot exasperation of the charge had not even yet worn away, but was still calling for fresh victims." About sunrise, a gunboat from Memphis arrived and began shelling the rebels along the riverbank. Instantly, General Forrest ordered the burning of all buildings and quartermaster stores. In a few minutes, the crackling sound of burning buildings came to my ears, and with it, the horrible apprehension that the rows of cabins where our helpless wounded were lying would soon be in flames. These fears were but all too well founded, for in almost less time than requires to tell about it, these buildings were on fire. No words of mine can depict the awful horror at that moment. The air soon became hot and stifling. With my right lung pierced with a mini-ball, the process of breathing was momentarily becoming more difficult and painful. It verily seemed that those of us who, although desperately wounded, had nevertheless escaped death in the storm of battle, had been reserved for a worse fate. Why was it, I thought, that the demon fire had been summoned to complete the horrors of that awful hour? Was it not enough that many of our brave comrades had been mercilessly shot down after the capture? Was not the fact that our forces had defended the flag against overwhelming numbers a thing to be rightly considered, even by the enemy? The open door of the cabin wherein I was lying was but a few feet away, and although the strongest impulse was upon me to walk out and enjoy the fresh morning air, still I was powerless to move. The little cabin, with its wounded and helpless inmates, was actually on fire. Soon through cracks and crevices, I caught glimpses of the mad flames that seemed all too eager to consume the slender thread that still held us to life. The last ray of hope seemed to be bidding us a long farewell, and the night I knew, in 5 or at most 10 minutes more, without help, the frail tenure by which we held to life would be consumed in fire and smoke. Then, like a flash, a soldier rushed in, and seizing my shoulders, drew me forth from the burning building, more dead than alive. Others were rescued in the same manner. How many, I know not. In a few minutes more, the cabins were entirely consumed. As to whether or not any of the wounded were burned, I cannot speak from personal knowledge. The testimony taken by the Committee on the Conduct of the War seemed, however, to indicate unmistakably that such was the fate of some of our wounded. From the report of this committee I quote, "The charred remains of 5 or 6 bodies were afterwards found, all but one so much disfigured and consumed by the flames that they could not be identified, and the identification of that one is not absolutely certain, although there can hardly be a doubt that it was the body of Lieutenant Ackerstrom, quartermaster of the 13th Tennessee Cavalry. Several witnesses who saw the remains, and who were personally acquainted with him while living, have testified that it is their firm belief that it was his body that it was thus treated. I was dragged a distance of 40 or 50 yards from the burning building, and left on the field, with a number of our wounded, white and black, within a few feet of me. I heard considerable firing near me on different parts of the field, and presently a rebel soldier walked past me, halted, and with a curse aimed his gun at a wounded coloured soldier who lay with his head and shoulders resting against a stump, some 10 or 12 yards away. The soldier begged for his life, but the next instant a bullet crashed through his brain. Another coloured soldier was standing a few feet away. He had an ugly wound through his wrist, and on him the same rebel turned, reloaded his piece, and aimed at his head. the wounded man meanwhile pleading for his life and exclaiming, "The Yankees made me fight, massa." The murderer's gun snapped, and as coolly as an executioner at a hog killing, the rebel brought down his weapon, jarred the powder into the tube, placed on a fresh percussion cap, again took aim, and the wounded soldier joined his comrade in death. These two murders of wounded coloured soldiers I saw committed the day following the battle. What was the effect of the other firing on different parts of the field that I heard about the same time, I cannot say. It is fair to presume, however, that the same motives that prompted the murder of these two men likewise directed the other firing, and probably with like effect. While these buildings were burning, Forrest sent a flag of truce to the officer of the gunboat, with a message to the effect that if the naval authorities would recognise his right to parole such of the wounded men as were unable to march, he would permit a party to land and remove them. Under this arrangement, a detail of men was sent ashore to bury the dead and remove the wounded. Leaming's account was backed up the next month, when the New York Times received a letter from a naval officer describing the bloody scene at Fort Pillow and demanding the Union government to retaliate. This letter was from Robert S. Critchell, an acting master's mate, and addressed to US Representative Henry Blow. I write because most of our crew are coloured, and I feel personally interested in the retaliation which our government may deal out to the rebels, when the fact of the merciless butchery is fully established. He also detailed how coloured troops had been murdered by the Confederate soldiers. I found many of the dead lying close along by the water's edge, where they had evidently sought safety. They could not offer any resistance from the places where they were, in holes and caves along the banks. Most of them had 2 wounds. I saw several coloured soldiers of the 6th United States Artillery with their eyes punched out with bayonets. Many of them were shot twice and bayoneted also. Critchell was appalled by the gruesome scene of 70 black soldiers lying dead along the Mississippi River. Going up into the fort, I saw their bodies partially consumed by fire. Whether burned before or after death, I cannot say. Anyway, there were several companies of rebels in the fort while these bodies were burning, and they could have pulled them out of the fire had they chosen to do so. Forrest was keen to distance himself from any scandal after the war, and in particular, any calls on him being a war criminal. He gave an interview many years after the war to the Philadelphia Weekly Times. He wrote,
"The Negroes ran out down to the river, and although the white flag was flying, they kept on turning back and shooting at my men, who consequently continued to fire into them, crowded on the brink of the river. And they killed a good many of them, in spite of my efforts and those of their officers to stop them. But there was no deliberate intention nor effort to massacre the garrison, as has been so generally reported by the northern papers."
And yet, his immediate report to his superiors after Fort Pillow state a different case. The river was dyed with blood of the slaughtered for 200 yards. The approximate loss was upward of 500 killed, but few of the officers escaping. My loss was about 20 killed and 60 wounded. It is hoped that these facts will demonstrate to the northern people that Negro soldiers cannot cope with Southerners. With battle being chaotic, the fog of war and the excitement of the moment could cloud people's recollections as to what exactly took place. Was it a massacre that could have been avoided? Did Forrest issue those fatal commands? Did he in fact lose control of his men? Or were all the deaths all part and parcel of a civil war and all the horrors that entails? But there were 2 more reports, written very soon after the battle and written by eyewitnesses. They are unfortunately both from the Union point of view and must be read with a sense of caution. They are both from naval officers who were serving aboard the US gunboat USS Silver Cloud. The first is by Acting Master William Ferguson, who was in charge of the gunboat. His letter to Major General Hurlbut, commanding officer of the Union's 16th Corps of the Army of the Tennessee, was written just 2 days after the battle. He begins his report with the general situation of Fort Pillow. He reported that the fort had been taken by assault and makes special mention of the fact that it was defended by white and coloured troops. By the time of the arrival of the Silver Cloud, the Confederates had evacuated the fort, but they were still in the vicinity. Ferguson writes, "I arrived off the fort at 6 a.m, and on the morning of the 13th instant, parties of rebel cavalry were picketing on the hills around the fort, and shelling those away, I made a landing and took on board some 20 of our troops, some of them badly wounded, who had concealed themselves along the bank and came out when they saw my vessel. While doing so, I was fired upon by rebel sharpshooters posted on the hills, and one wounded man limping down to the vessel was shot. But the brief firefight was not to last, and around 8 in the morning, General Forrest sent forward a flag of truce. Forrest, it seems, was happy for the Union troops to retake the fort and see to the Union dead and wounded." Ferguson writes that Forrest himself had no intention of doing that himself. Ferguson took control, and with the aid of the steamer Platte Valley, he began loading wounded onto her from the scorched fort and battlefield. Ferguson does, in his defence, mention that a party of rebel soldiers were an assistance in getting the wounded onto the steamer. Yet the horror of the fort's demise was soon to be entered into Ferguson's report. He continues, "We found about 70 wounded men in the fort and around it, and buried, I should think, 150 bodies. All the buildings around the fort and tents and huts in the fort had been burned by the rebels, and among the embers the charred remains of numbers of our soldiers who had suffered a terrible death in the flames could be seen." The next paragraph of his report, though a picture of hell, does leave some questions unanswered. All the wounded who had strength enough to speak agreed that after the fort was taken, an indiscriminate slaughter of our troops was carried on by the enemy with a furious and vindictive savageness which was never equalled by the most ruthless and merciless Indian tribes. Around on every side, horrible testimony to the truth of this statement could be seen. Bodies with gaping wounds, some bayoneted through the eyes, some with skulls beaten through, others with hideous wounds as if their bowels had been ripped open by bowie knives, plainly told that but little quarter was shown to our troops. Strewn from the fort to the riverbank, in the ravines and hollows, behind logs and under the brush where they had crept for protection from the assassins who pursued them, we found bodies bayoneted, beaten and shot to death, showing how cold-blooded and persistent was the slaughter of our unfortunate troops. Ferguson here mentions in great detail the horror that was in front of him and of his men. He describes wounds and killing blows, and strangely the weapons used. How did he know that bayonets were used? Was he saying bowie knives had been used to suggest the Confederates had killed unarmed men in some kind of blood-soaked massacre? Ferguson was a naval officer, and unless he had experienced land warfare, his description on exactly how men had died should be read with caution. Yet he was convinced of killings being done after men had been surrendering. He writes, "Of course, when a work is carried by assault, there will always be more or less bloodshed, even when all resistance has ceased. But here there was unmistakable evidence of a massacre carried on long after any resistance could have been offered, with a cold-blooded barbarity and perseverance which nothing can palliate. As near as I can learn, there were about 500 men in the fort when it was stormed. I received about 100, including the wounded and those I took on board before the flag of truce was sent in. The rebels, I learned, had few prisoners, so that at least 300 of our troops must have been killed in this affair." He concluded his report to the general with a list of the wounded officers and men he had been able to rescue. The second account is from a man we have already heard from, acting master's mate Robert Critchell, also on board the gunboat Silver Cloud. Critchell's account was written a week after the incident, and was written not to a commanding officer, but to US Representative Henry Blow of Missouri. It may seem strange that he was reporting to a politician and not a soldier, but it would appear that Henry Blow had been partly responsible for Critchell getting an appointment in the first place. Critchell writes, "Sir, since you did me the favour of recommending my appointment last year, I have been on duty aboard this boat. I now write to you with reference to the Fort Pillow massacre, because some of the crew are coloured, and I feel personally interested in the retaliation which our government may deal out to the rebels when the fact of the merciless butchery is fully established." Whereas Ferguson appears shocked by what he saw, Critchell seems more angered and more intent to deal out vengeance on the evildoers. His writing is full of revulsion at the brutality of the rebels, and has nothing but disdain for their excuses. The Confederate officers who claim to have lost control of their men does not seem to hold much water for Critchell. He begins his report as Ferguson did, by describing their arrival, their shelling of rebel positions, and then a flag of truce being called. Critchell takes up the story as the Union sailors landed. We then landed at the fort, and I was sent out with a burial party to bury our dead. I found many of the dead lying close along by the water's edge. I saw several coloured soldiers of the 6th United States Artillery, with their eyes punched out with bayonets. Many of them were shot and bayoneted also. Also along the bank of the river were coloured. The number of the coloured near the river was about 70. Going up into the fort, I saw their bodies partially consumed by fire. One of the wounded negroes told me that he hadn't done a thing, and when the rebels drove our men out into the fort, they threw away their guns and cried out that they had surrendered, but they kept on shooting them down until they had shot all but a few. This is what they all say. Critchell continues and makes it quite clear he did not believe the tales told to him by the Confederates assisting the Union wounded. I had some conversation with rebel officers, and they claim that our men would not surrender, and in some few cases they could not control their men, who seemed determined to shoot down every Negro soldier whether he surrendered or not. This is a flimsy excuse, for after our coloured soldiers had been driven from the fort, they were surrounded by the rebels on all sides. It is apparent that they would do what all say they did, throw down their arms and beg for mercy. Critchell concludes his report by highlighting that very few white men were buried. In total, he writes that the crew of the gunboat New Era buried about 100 men. So what of the aftermath of this terrible battle? Though numbers vary, the Union defenders lost about 300 men, and the Confederates under 20. Fort Pillow, with its traditional first phase of battle, followed by a more bloody and terrible finale, was of little tactical significance. So little, in fact, that Forrest abandoned the fort the very next day. It did not take long for the news of the massacre to spread, and the US Congress set about investigating it. The inquiry recorded from the survivors, brought to them by the Platte Valley steamer, that out of the 300 dead, 200 were coloured soldiers. Witnesses also stated that the wounds suffered by Union soldiers were in the main in the head and torso. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of this small-scale battle was the stiffening of resolve in the Union ranks. The battle cry of "Remember Fort Pillow" became a rallying cry, especially for African American soldiers. Only a few days after Fort Pillow was attacked, General Grant himself had ordered General Butler, who was negotiating prisoner exchanges, to demand that black soldiers be treated equally to their white comrades. He added that if the Confederates refused, that the exchange of prisoners would cease. The Southern Secretary of War, James Seddon, was not exactly fazed by Grant's demand. Refusing his request, he said, "I doubt, however, whether the exchange of Negroes at all for our soldiers would be tolerated. As to the white officers serving with Negro troops, we ought never to be inconvenienced with such prisoners." The Union had already established a policy to discourage the killing and enslaving prisoners of war. A year before Fort Pillow, President Lincoln wrote his order of retaliation. "It is therefore ordered that for every soldier of the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed. And for every one enslaved by the enemy or sold into slavery, a rebel soldier shall be placed at hard labour on the public works, and continued at such labour until the other shall be released and receive the treatment due to a prisoner of war." The policy did not lead to any action, and the same merciless behaviour was shown by Southern troops after the Battle of the Crater in July 1864, where surrendering black US soldiers were shot rather than taken prisoner. So the burning questions: did Forrest order the massacre of the garrison of Fort Pillow? Were the surrendering Union soldiers still fighting or resisting capture? Forrest's association with the post-war Ku Klux Klan certainly did nothing to enhance his reputation in the North, though he not only ordered the Klan's dissolution, but also went on publicly to call for social and political advancement for blacks. In the years before his death in 1877, Forrest was clearly a changed man, tired of the race struggle and his reputation as the butcher of Fort Pillow. Not long before his death, Forrest was invited to speak at a black political gathering. The racial open-mindedness that seems to have been growing in him in his later years is clearly evident in the words he spoke that very evening.
I came here with the jeers of some white people who think that I am doing wrong. We have but one flag, one country. Let us stand together. Many things have been said about me which are wrong. I have been in the heat of battle when colored men asked me to protect them. I have placed myself between them and the bullets of my men and told them they should be kept unharmed. Go to work, be industrious, live honestly, and act truly, and when you are oppressed, I'll come to your relief. I am with you in heart and in hand.
There were, of course, extreme views and hatred throughout the war. The volatile mixture of racial animosity, long-simmering feuds, reports of atrocities committed against their own women and children, devastation and raids, physical exhaustion, battle excitement, and fear for their own lives, produce a brief but deadly spasm of revenge. More tales would come out about the massacre at Fort Pillow. Private Benjamin Robinson told government investigators that he saw the Confederates shoot 2 white men right by the side of me after they had laid their guns down. Fellow Private Ransom Anderson testified that he was slashed with a bayonet while lying on the ground after surrendering, and that he observed another member of B Company, Cooley Rice, stabbed by a rebel soldier with a bayonet, and the bayonet broken off in his body. Union cavalryman Daniel Stamps later testified that, "While I was standing at the bottom of the hill, I heard a rebel officer shout an order of some kind to the men who had taken us, and saw a rebel soldier standing by me. I asked him what the officer had said. It was, 'Kill the last damn one of them.' The soldier replied to his officer that we had surrendered, that we were prisoners and must not be shot. The officer again replied, seeming crazy with rage that it had not been obeyed, 'I tell you to kill the last goddamn one of them.'" Whoever, if anyone, had issued such an order, it might not have been Forrest. Chalmers told a captured Union officer the next day that he and Forrest had stopped the massacre as soon as we were able to do so. Another Confederate at the scene, Surgeon Samuel H. Caldwell of the 16th Tennessee Cavalry, wrote to his wife on the 15th of April, "If General Forrest had not run between our men and the Yanks with his pistol and sabre drawn, not a man would have been spared." Brigade Commander Colonel Bell blamed what he called promiscuous firing by Forrest's men on the drunken, panicky behaviour of the enemy. The drunken condition of the garrison and the failure of Colonel Bradford to surrender, thus necessitating the assault, were the causes of the fatality. Forrest's jubilant first report 3 days after the battle encouraged such a reading.
The victory was complete. The river was dyed with the blood of the slaughtered for 200 yards. It is hoped that these facts will demonstrate to the Northern people that Negro soldiers cannot cope with Southerners.
Chalmers echoed those sentiments. The Confederate victory at Fort Pillow, he said, had taught the mongrel garrison of blacks and renegades a lesson long to be remembered. Forrest himself, in a little-known post-war interview with fellow Confederate General Dabney Maury in the Philadelphia Weekly Times, went to some pains to minimize his role in the battle.
When we got into the fort, the white flag was shown at once. The Negroes ran out down to the river, and although the white flag was flying, they kept on turning back and shooting at my men who consequently continued to fire into them, crowded on the brink of the river.
Deliberate or not, the casualty figures at Fort Pillow would linger over Forrest for the remainder of the war. Even after Sherman determined that there was no cause for further investigation of retaliation, said, "Let the soldiers affected make their own rules as we progress," Sherman told Secretary of War Stanton. "We will use our own logic against the enemy, as we have from the beginning of the war." Subsequently, the battle cry, "Remember Fort Pillow," would rise from Union soldiers' lips for the remainder of the war. Most accounts, again from those on both sides, indicate that Forrest was not present when the atrocities began, and that when he did arrive at the fort, he and his officers immediately took steps to restore order and halt the outrages. Regarding the surrender demanded by Forrest, Captain Goodman, the bearer of the surrender, said later he clearly remembered the offer was meant to treat the entire garrison as prisoners, because when the note was handed to me, he said, there was some discussion about it among the officers present, and it was asked whether it was intended to include the Negro soldiers as well as the white, to which both General Forrest and General Chalmers replied that it was so intended. However, other accounts indicate that the Confederates were in no mood to take prisoners. He later wrote about the bodies he discovered. Some of them were burned as if by powder around the holes in their heads, which led me to conclude that they were shot at very close range. One of the gunboat officers who accompanied us asked General Chalmers if most of the Negroes were not killed after the Confederates had taken possession. Chalmers replied that he thought they had, and that the men of General Forrest's command had such a hatred for the armed Negro that they could not be restrained from killing them after they had captured them. He said they were not killed by General Forrest's orders, that both Forrest and he stopped the massacre as soon as they were able to do so. He said it was nothing better than we could expect as long as we persisted in arming the Negro. This became another point of contention in the battle's aftermath. The Confederates were firing weapons that used black powder, which was known to leave powder burns when fired from extremely close range, such as when the Confederates swarmed over Fort Pillow's ramparts. Whilst Forrest perhaps did not give an order to wipe out the entire garrison, he had certainly lost control of his men, and certainly could have done more to save the lives of the Union soldiers. At the same time, the garrison had outrightly refused an appeal to surrender. Still, had the black troops formally laid down their arms, there could not have been an expectation that they would have all been treated as prisoners of war. Our last point produces more grey areas than a black and white answer. In 1862, Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon wrote a letter outlining the policy on what the Confederates were supposed to do with black prisoners. He wrote, "The question as to the slaves taken in federal uniform and with arms in their hands has been considered in conference with the President. Slaves in flagrant rebellion are subject to death by the laws of every slave-holding state. They cannot be recognized in any way as soldiers subject to the rules of war and to trial by military courts. Yet, for example, and to repress any spirit of insubordination, it is deemed essential that slaves in armed insurrection should meet punishment. Summary execution must therefore be inflicted on those taken, and with the slaves referred to by General Mercer, under circumstances indicative beyond doubt of actual rebellion." The grisly tale of the Massacre of Fort Pillow still resounds today, and heated arguments and hot passions still abound on the subject. To see our video on the effects of shell shock during the American Civil War, and the crazy tale of a soldier who loaded his rifle 23 times without firing it, click here. Thanks for watching.